This is a very special episode of the Upper Hand Fantasy Podcast. I'm here with Dwain McFarland today. If you're not familiar with Dwain, yet you listen to this show, you should know that Dwain is a big part of my personal evolution around analytics and my data-led approach to fantasy football. I don't consume much fantasy content anymore, but I make sure to make time for anything Dwain has to say and anything that he puts out. It is well worth it. He was at PFF and now he's killing it at Fantasy Life. All their content, including Dwayne's, is completely free over there. So make sure to go check him out and the rest of the awesome Fantasy Life team at fantasylife.com. He has been on the show before, but I'm honored to always have him back. I'm always learning something new. Welcome, Dwain McFarland.
Hey man, I don't know if I can live up to that intro, but I really enjoy being on your show. I appreciate you having me on. You have a great audience. You get a lot of great interaction. I think you're really good at what you do. So man, anytime I can just join other great content creators or football minds, like I'm down to do that.
That means so much. It's like that Denzel Washington gif where he just like, oh, like he just holds his heart and he's like, oh, thank you. That's kind of how
Well,
I'm
first
feeling
of all,
right
I
now.
said other great football minds. That would assume that I am one, which I'm not, but you are. So we're good.
Appreciate that, man. So, Dwayne, we put so much work into analyzing, these NFL prospects, and the
Yeah.
NFL draft is right around the corner. 2 weeks from now, less than 2 weeks from now. It's Friday, April
Almost
12th.
here, man.
Almost here. It's crazy. And we've been putting so much work. I've seen how much work you have been putting into this whole process. We're looking at the numbers, we're looking at the film. But let's say you didn't do any of that, right? Let's say you're a casual fan, right? And you play fantasy football. You had no time to do any of that, but you just focused on first and second round draft capital. Is there a decent chance that you hit on those running backs and wide receivers? Like, would you say that that's relatively
Yeah, if
true?
you were just looking for a shortcut, that would be it. In fact, like when you build out a model, like what we're going to talk about in some of these positions, like my first goal is to, get the pre-draft model, meaning without draft capital in the model as an input. If I can get it close or above draft capital, like you're doing really great. And like in total transparency, my wide receiver model right now is still slightly below draft capital. My tight end model is even with draft capital, and this is on a correlation, or like I've run the R squared numbers on these, and then my running back model is ahead of draft capital. Now, when I say draft capital, there is an important distinction. So one cheat code that can really help you, and it's kind of nerdy, but just remember draft capital is not linear, right? It's logarithmic. So what that means is when you go from pick one to the end of the second round, like there is a huge drop off in value. If you were pick one versus pick four in the NFL draft, there's a big drop off. Most people have heard of the Jimmy Johnson trade chart, right? So essentially, it's that kind of thing. As you get to, once you get past 60, pick 64, actually, which is the end of the second round, things really start to flatten out. So there's not as much difference in those players. And we see that bear out when you just run data against what round a player was picked in. But why I say it's a cheat code is because like when you look at NFL draft capital, like the correlations are much higher to future fantasy success than just draft pick. Right. So again, but it does go back to what you said. Like the easiest way to put it is when they're taken, the earlier they're taken, especially in that early first round, it's huge. And you'll notice it in my model because the way draft capital gets weighted is I'm actually using Chase Stewart's version of the Jimmy Johnson trade chart. So Chase Stewart, he went back and did more work looking at how players' careers turned out and did an estimated value of what each draft pick is worth. That's, a newer version. And so in the model, like if you go pick one, it's taking pick one times that value. And then I index that on a scale of 0 or basically 0 to 1. Right. And so what you'll notice is the guys that go in the top 4 or 5 picks, you'll see, oh my God, like, look, they're at the 89th, 95th percentile in these models and things, even if other things are really wrong with their profile. So draft capital just really matters a lot. So yes, if you can just do one thing, I know that was too long of an answer, but yes, if you could just do one thing, looking at the draft capital is good. But the goal of the model is to see, can we do better than that? Right? Can we
So
find a way to find an edge?
how much of a difference is it though? Then if a player gets picked, top 5, top 10, compared to some of these wide receivers, like we're looking at, we're looking at Keon, we're looking at, AD Mitchell, Xavier Worthy, Troy Franklin, all those guys potentially first round. Right now, it's still first round draft capital, but how much of a difference are we looking at in terms of hit
It's a
rates?
big difference. So I happen to have running backs up right now, and I don't want to open the other sheets because I don't want your and my lights to flicker and maybe half of a state have their electricity go out. But I've got running back open because I'm working on it today. And so, for example, Jonathan Brooks right now, his expected draft capital. Now this is based on mock drafts. And the further you get away from the first round, the more inaccurate these become because the data becomes sporadic, things like that. So take it with a grain of salt, but it's an input just as a placeholder for now. But Jonathan Brooks in this class, he's projected to go pick 47, round 2. That's a 33rd percentile in draft pick value index, right?
Wow.
So that tells you how far off that is from, pick 1. Trey Benson's expected to go, pick 59. So 12 picks later, he's in the 28th percentile. Okay.
Wow.
And then what you'll notice is once you get to these later guys, it doesn't drop off as much. You'll have a guy go from round 4 to round 5. Yeah, it drops off, but it's not near as huge. So it doesn't impact their profile as much. But looking at the guys.
That means we're looking
ahead.
at a big difference, for example, between Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, obviously,
Huge.
where they got drafted compared to where, guys like Trey Benson and Jonathan Brooks are going to be taken this year.
And there's reasons for that. One, the NFL has everything to lose by, not getting their picks right. So they're obviously investing. It's a multi-billion dollar industry. They're investing a lot of money in trying to get these picks right. I don't think that necessarily means that they're always perfect, right? Just like anything, but they're invested in doing it. And then think about it another way. Once you invest in something, let's say, and think about that draft capital, it matters. Like the way an NFL team thinks about a 5th round pick and the value of it on that trade chart is very different than the number 3 pick overall. So say you manage investment properties and you've got a $2 million property that you're renting out. And then you've got, a couple of other properties, that are worth, $200,000, $300,000 in this economy. Let's just be honest. Anything's worth $500,000. Right. So but the point being, which one are you going to give the most attention to? You're going to care about all of them, but you're going to make sure that $3 million property has got the right renter. You're not going to want it being trashed. You're going to also need to keep it, you're going to have to really keep it clean because you got to have a renter that will want to rent it, that can, obviously has money, right? And so they're going to have choices. So it's the same kind of thing. It's not a perfect analogy, but the more a team invests, the more they want the pick to be right. A GM, their job is to get picks right. So they want to give those guys more of a chance to do things well. When you see early first round picks bust, that's not good for the general manager. It's also typically not good for coaches because, their shelf life as a coach is not that long in the league. And it is the place where you can get the most tension between a coach and a GM, and where you can imagine these behind the scenes things going, hey man, I need the first round pick to play. I need him to at least be on the field. And the coach is probably, man, he's no good in practice. And the GM's like, yeah, but we got to give him a chance because, we've already sunk a lot of money into this.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the Jets taking Will McDonald over JSN last year in the first round. Still hurt, at least JSN didn't go completely apeshit in the first, last year, so that I don't feel as bad. But still
at least your favorite team didn't take Mozzie Smith and Luke Schoonmaker. So
listen, man,
guys that shouldn't have even been maybe fourth round picks, but whatever.
Life as a Jets fan is just it's a little brutal, just a little bit. We'll see. Hopefully Aaron Rodgers this year. I'm hoping that Odunze potentially on the board.
That would be great.
We'll get there, Brock Bowers potentially, and we'll get there in a second. That exact question, we're going to be talking about that because that's something that's on my mind, a lot of Jets fans' minds too. But now, how much does landing spot matter for running backs and wide receivers? On a big enough sample, right? Does the data show that if you're good, you are good and you will come through for the most part, regardless of landing spot, right? Or does landing spot matter more to the point where we should almost care about that more versus the talent?
So I think it, depends, but number one, it's talent, right? So, but there are circumstances, even where really talented players, you bring up one like JSN, they land in a spot where there's DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett already on the team, and they're on a team that doesn't run a lot of 3 wide receivers. Now we kind of hope, you invested in JSN, and we're in, predicting what coaches are going to do is really tricky. So I try not to overweight it too much. I've got a coaching database where I've studied all this stuff, and there are certain guys that tend to kind of stick to their scheme, but the league is becoming more and more, and I think this is a good thing, about coaches who are more willing to adapt, right, to their personnel. They're more willing to think differently about deploying players that, 10 years ago couldn't get on the field that often, like a Tank Dell, and look how well he shined last year. Their staff is like, so what? He's a good player. He weighs 165 pounds. We don't care. We're just moving all over the formation. And so landing spot, does matter, but the talent is still the number one driver. And so the way I look at it is, when you grade out players, and part of what the model does is looks at, what are all the ways the player can be applied? How diverse is their skill set? So if you look at a player like Marvin Harrison, who can play the X, he can win deep, he can win intermediate, he can win underneath. No matter where he lands, he's going to be on the field as a year one player. Even if he lands on a team with another good wide receiver, he's going to be out there. However, you could find another wide receiver that you're like, this guy's really good at the one thing he does. He's a great slot wide receiver. He's a mismatch underneath, but he's not great deep. Well, that's a red flag, because if he lands on a team that runs, more, heavy personnel sets, or doesn't want to pass the ball all the time, and you've seen this multiple times. That's why a guy like Hunter Renfrow can suddenly pop up and be a fantasy asset and then just go away. It's not that Hunter Renfrow necessarily suddenly became a bad player. It's that, the way that they were operating their offense changed, and they weren't using 11 personnel all the time. So if you've got a slot wide receiver that's really, that doesn't have vertical and underneath aspects to their game, and remember, people freaked out about Justin Jefferson a few years ago, so you have to be careful with this. Justin Jefferson, yeah, he played in the slot in college, but he was really good at attacking all areas of the field. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for. The more diverse your talent, obviously the data is going to tell us you're a good talent, but looking for the diversity in your talent, meaning you have a lot of outs. You could kind of land in any kind of scenario and be good, or you've got a much more narrow path. And those guys, it's not always locked in that they can't do other things. Sometimes they surprise us at the next level, and you're like, oh man, he never did that in college, and now he does. And again, that comes back to coaching. You don't always know for sure if a player might have been able to be used in a different way had they been given the opportunity, especially if they played at a big program with other superstars around them. Typically at smaller schools, if you're good, like, the team's going to let you do everything you can, to be good. So if you think about like a Jacob Cowing, some of these other, some of these unheralded guys that pop in some of the analytics, so that would be my answer. Typically, yeah, talent is the trump card, but you got to look at what are all the ways the player can be applied, and the more ways they can win. And running back's a great example. A lot of guys come into the league, right? And you look at their college profile, and you're like, man, like, they never really got on the field on pass downs. Even when they were out there, they were not good. They didn't earn a lot of targets. There's issues with their pass blocking. Like, that's a big red flag. You really need that kind of player, and they could develop those skills, but it's not a given. So you really need that style of player to land somewhere where they can immediately win an early down role. And hopefully it's on a good offense that has a chance to score a lot of touchdowns. Whereas if you've got a guy that can play all downs, okay, well, now we're talking a guy that could eventually, even if he lands on a team where there's a really good starter in front of him, if the starter goes down, like, he's suddenly in an every down role. If he lands on a team with a starter that's good on early downs, but maybe he's immediately better in the passing game, so that can get him on the field. Or he lands on a team that has a good passing down back, but because he's really good in practice and short yardage, he wins that role. So the more diverse a player is, the more outs they get, and also the higher their ceiling. Because in the end, fantasy still comes down to volume, especially for running backs, and we want guys that can be on the field all the time.
Yeah, you have those deep threats potentially, who can potentially only win downfield, right? I look like,
Yes.
I look at
Great
someone like
example.
Troy Franklin. Like, is he that guy? Can he be more versatile? Jermaine Burton, his profile also another one that, a lot of deep shots, but a lot of things about him are intriguing. Maybe they didn't use him the right way. Who knows, right? There's a lot of different, sometimes these players come into the NFL used differently, right? And then you're like, oh, okay, like, look at that skill set that we didn't even see in college.
Yep.
But it's tough to bet on, right? It's funny you brought up Jacob Cowing. That's how I know you're deep in the spreadsheets, Dwayne, because you look at Cowing's profile, like the production profile is absolutely, it's crazy, right? It's huge, but it is worth knowing with him. He didn't play in the Power 5 his whole career, right? So that's one thing to take into consideration.
Yep.
But if he did and he had those numbers, then you're like, okay, all right, now we're talking. Now we're talking. But anyway, all right. So we're gonna get back to the running back position and the wide receiver position in a second. Let's get the tight end position over with, okay? Because it's only a couple guys here. Depending on draft capital for tight ends, doesn't always seem to be the way to go. way more of a crapshoot of a position to hit on. Is there anything specific you look at to try and increase your hit rate for tight ends? And how do you think the tight ends in this class specifically, Brock Bowers and company, how do they stack up?
Yeah. So first of all, I might be the most excited. Like I think the most improved model of the supermodel, like so saying is for running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, is tight end. And it's one that's always bothered me. And sometimes the answer is you can't always hone these things in. You may test multiple variables, and that's what I do. I'm testing all these different variables to see what really correlates to future production in the NFL, i.e., fantasy points. And then once I have those things, I test all of them against one another to see how much they overlap, to determine like, okay, really this thing is telling me the same thing. And then I kind of think through it and I may eliminate one of those things. Or if I think the two things are capturing different things, even though they have similarity, then I may create a composite score between those two things, because you don't want to overweight. You don't want to be double and triple counting things, in your model. And you want your model to be as simple as possible, because it allows you to more easily, assess it at the end of the year and see where things went right, where things went wrong. And, if you can't easily explain it or understand it, then it can also often be hard for you to then understand, like, okay, where do I need to go next, with the model, when you assess it. So when looking at tight ends, just real quickly, and folks can go check all this out. Like you mentioned, it's all over at fantasylife.com for free. When you check out my tier articles, you will see at the bottom of each one, I've got a full breakdown of how the model works. If you want to know exactly how the correlation stacked out, how I'm weighting these things, I pretty much lay all of that out for you. There is also a tool over at Fantasy Life. If you go to tools, go down to dynasty, and then you go to rookie models. And when you click on that, I've actually given you data back to 2018. So you can compare all of these different prospects, how they scored in the model. You'll see the guys I've missed on. You'll see the guys that I've hit on. And I'm transparent about it all, because this is all a work in progress. Like I just want to continue to get better at it. But real quickly,
No, but hold on a
what
second.
happened? Yeah, go
I
ahead.
just want to say that tool is so useful. And not only that, if you go to that tool right now and you go to wide receivers, because I think wide receiver is heading up right now.
Yeah.
You look at the top names in that list. It's looking pretty nice. Looking
Two of the
pretty
top
nice.
three, are
Oh
from
yeah.
this class.
Yeah,
And
yeah, it's looking
yeah.
pretty nice. Okay, but also my point is that a lot of the guys who have hit recently are also at the top of that model
Yes.
too. Okay, so just saying,
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Please go
And,
ahead.
and and again, running back is the best, and people will notice it. Like pretty much you're going to see, like when the model says someone's good at running back, like basically if they're above the 60th percentile, you're going to be like, yep, they're good. And
Yep.
that's where I want to get all the models. But again, there's
Makes sense.
more. We're kind of going on a little bit of a variant here, but think about wide receiver. There's so many other dependencies.
Oh yeah.
You've got a quarterback. You got to be on the same page. You're going to face much more different, I don't want to say way more different. Depends on the conference you play on. A lot of these, honestly, coverage concepts come from the college upward to the NFL. Like, and you see it in these Bill Belichick things where he's talking with Nick Saban, and he's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
he's like, your linebacker runs this modifier and does the switch here," and like you're
Yep.
just like, "Oh man!" Like Bill Belichick, like the NFL, we think of as being the mecca. Like he's learning from college, but the
Yeah.
competition you play against, right, is going to change. Now every weekend you have to play against other really good players. You're the 1% of the 1% at that point.
Exactly.
So real quickly on the tight end model, like what I will say is, again, it's the most improved model. The model without draft capital in it is equal to draft capital. The model with draft capital in it is better than draft capital alone. So like that's where we want to be. And just real quickly on the inputs, draft capital obviously is a big component. And then the thing that unlocked everything this year on tight end that really changed things for me was adjusted career receiving yards per team pass attempt. And you guys have heard of receiving yards per team pass attempt and people adjusting it for age. It's a great measure because it is helping account for the type of offense a player plays in. You may play on a pass heavy offense versus a run first offense. That makes it really hard to compare. Oh, well, this receiver had this many receiving yards per game versus this one over here. This one had 125. This one had 85. The 85 may actually be more impressive depending on their circumstance. So I took that a level further and I really tested a bunch of things to say, okay, what are the other things that I know that I can get to data for that might really be impacting the way a wide receiver or a tight end performs? And I thought, okay, quarterback play, because I just got through doing a bunch of stuff at the NFL level on this when Kirk Cousins left the Vikings, and I put out a video on YouTube about what that could mean for Justin Jefferson. So I started studying the data for quarterback, and it did impact. It did impact the wide, and that makes sense. It impacts the tight end. So now, if you play with a really bad quarterback, the model accounts for that. You've got an expected, and I'm going to call it RIPTA, and you guys can all thank Ian Harditz. He named it RIPTA. We got tired of saying receiving yards per team pass attempt, and I'm like, dude, let's go with it. RIPTA. It sounds cool. So a player's career RIPTA now is adjusted for their quarterback play. It's also adjusted for, did they play with other players on their team that were really good RIPTA performers? So what was your competition like? And then the final thing is average depth of target. Because as average depth of target goes up, the expectation for your RIPTA also goes up. But there are other things that go down, like it's inverse. Your contested catch rate, it's going to go up as your ADOT goes up because you're throwing into more coverage. More likely a safety's coming into the picture with the primary coverage player, all these sort of things. So I won't keep detailing it all out, but now the model is all based on what you should have done based on those factors and what you did do. And then again, I'm indexing that. The other thing that's been in the model before, but shout out to a guy named Billy Elder on Twitter. Does not have enough followers, but a really smart dude. And I was interacting with him, but it's the program quality index. So I was accounting for where the player came from, but I essentially took the idea around draft capital and paired it together with where the player is coming from. So now if you come from a program like LSU that has spit out Odell Beckham Jr., Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, all these, and it really looks at where these players went in the draft. Okay, so it's going back to 2015. And if you've got a really strong program that's produced a lot of great wide receivers or other strong skill position players, you're now getting credit for that in the model. Before, it was a much more loosey kind of, hey, I'm grading a 1, 2, or a 3. Now I've got a better way to dial that in. So those are the biggest improvements. Other things have been in there, age and that sort of thing, and people can read the other things, but it's really unlocked a huge leap in the model for tight end. So I'm very, very excited about it.
Well, the fact that it can actually, the model can produce better than draft capital type of numbers, and that shows that it's a pretty successful model, and I'm sure you're going to be continuing to tweak that. And I've noticed that from last year to this
I
year,
could test all the time. I have so many ideas that I don't have time for that I just continually write down. So
100%, because I remember last year,
I welcome ideas from some of the best ideas come from engaging with other people.
right? And last year, I remember the model was pretty different. Like I remember it, a lot of the wide receiver stuff, you were taking into account a lot of other things. And I'm going to be asking you questions around that because there are certain things
like
that I
the
look
ADOT
at.
thing really impacted where JSN would have stood in the model.
Mm.
So JSN still scores well in the model, but now there's other context that we're capturing on the wide receiver side too. So yeah.
I like that. So where does Brock Bowers fall, and how does he stack up in your new model?
Yeah, Brock Bowers, man, he's amazing. So number one, like pedigree, he went to Georgia, comes in 55th percentile. When you guys read these write-ups, I also talk about like where they were in their recruiting class, who were the other recruits around them. But I mean, he was a top 59 recruit in 2021. He was the number 2 tight end in the nation. He had offers from 22 schools, and we're talking all of the big ones, guys: LSU, Clemson, Michigan, Notre Dame, tight end factory. These places all wanted Brock Bowers to come there. So that's a really good signal. And then if you look at, his production and athleticism, his adjusted career RIPTA, the thing we just talked about that accounts for all of these different things, 100th percentile, best ever in the model. So once you account for the quarterback he played with, the competition for targets, and then you look at, his average depth of target, he was plus 1.21 in RIPTA, plus 1.18, and plus 1.18 across those different categories. So he ranks very high. And then we also want something in the model that it captures, because sometimes, you're in really crowded offenses where even though I'm accounting for other players that were good in your offense, it's good to know, like, when the player got their chance, how good were they? And this is one that I really picked up from Peter Howard, PA Howdy, over on Twitter. Peter's always testing new things. I would say no one tests more new ideas than probably Peter, around dynasty, and like he's maniacal about it. Like he's great at this stuff. So I noticed that he was really he had been looking at, the quarterback rating, the targeted quarterback rating. So what was the quarterback's passer rating when they targeted a player? And it's number one, it showed signal. And number two, it's a really good, you want a blend of a data point like that to go along with production, because it can tell you, okay, but when they did get their opportunity, how good were they? And when you look at Brock Bowers, when quarterbacks looked his way, they had 141.9 quarterback rating. So if you look at that, that's in the 92nd percentile. So in context of his team, Brock Bowers was amazing. In context of just when he got his opportunities, Brock Bowers was also amazing. And so that obviously goes a long way for him in the model. I mean, this dude averaged 3.1 yards after contact, yak, right? Yards after the catch, yak, over expectation per catch.
So are you giving me permission now to use quarterback rating? I've always seen that stat on PFF, right? Because when you go to premium stats on PFF, you can see for wide receivers and other receivers, like what is the quarterback's passer rating when they're targeted.
Yep.
I've always looked at it as a miscellaneous type of stat. I didn't realize that it was one of those stats that is kind of sticky. So
it has signal.
Now I think, am I getting permission now from
especially
Dwain
for their career? I use it for their career. I think where it can
Right.
be dangerous is if you just look at 1 year at a time,
Sure.
right? So I think looking at their career, though, the nice thing also is it cuts through a lot of, well, if you're young, you may not have as much playing. Ultimately, we want guys that get on the field right away and they break out early, all those sort of things. And the age-adjusted component of RIPTA handles that. And I love the way it works as well, because we don't care about thresholds anymore. Dominator's out. I don't even look at Dominator anymore. Number one, it didn't test as well as the other. Yeah, it didn't test as well. Think about it. Dominator is looking at reception share and touchdown share.
Mhm.
Well, really, RIPTA is already looking at that, but in a better way. And they have so yardage share and RIPTA overlap a ton. Then if you look at touchdowns, well, I can look at a thing like targeted quarterback rating, and I really get an even broader feel for the player than just touchdowns. And it correlated more than just touchdowns per game. They were pretty close, but it gives me a little bit of added utilization, if you will, no pun intended on the utilization word there, but
yeah. So the fact that Ladd McConkey had the highest, seems to me, according to my database here, the highest career quarterback rating for his career.
Yeah, it matters. It matters even more for wide receivers. Quarterback rating
that's
hasn't even.
That's a huge thing for him, because his production profile is a little iffy, just because he's been off the field so much and he's had some injuries. So the fact that,
and again,
he's
pairing it's pairing it with a team-based metric like RIPTA, receiving yards per team attempt, is
right.
Now you're looking at when targeted quarterback rating is more of an efficiency kind of stat, right? And it's on a per opportunity basis. So when you have the opportunity to blend things like that, like it's giving you a broader view, of the prospect, and it tested out better than yards per route run.
So, yeah, it's crazy. And
yards per route run has and they were really close. Some of these things are really close, guys. And as you introduce new players into the sample next year and you see how players performed in the past, these things can move around. The other thing I want to note, like if you're going to create a model, what you don't want to do is do what we call overfitting. You're just trying to make your model look good by recalibrating the weights you give. I let the correlations that these things show to future fantasy success basically drive the way I weight them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, for sure. And I've been using yards per route run for years, and I've started to introduce.
And it's good. It's still a good data point, but it overlaps so much with RIPTA. I didn't want to use it, and RIPTA's better. RIPTA's just got a stronger signal.
I've kind of introduced first downs per route run into my process this year, kind of coinciding with yards per route run, kind of using those in conjunction, just because it kind of gives a better idea.
I think they're good.
But then guys like Troy Franklin end up scoring high, in both of those. And like, I just look, and then I watch.
So what I do in that example where you're going to have a decent amount of overlap between your two data points, and the way you do that is you just test the two variables against one another. Just run like a simple, you're using Excel, just use Coral. If you want to use the RSQ, that's even better. But once you look at that, And if you think that that's high, then what I will do is say, based on what I'm seeing in the model, about a 20% weight needed to go to those two things. I might, because there's so much overlap, I may cut it, I may just say one's worth 10% and the other's worth 10, and together they come together into a composite score. And then that gets 20% together. That's,
Okay.
and so that
Okay,
helps you
gotcha.
avoid like double, to your point, you end up double counting something, and a guy like Troy Franklin moves up too far on your list. And then overall, when you go to rerun all that against, future production, it'll hurt your model. And you'll know because you're counting things too much. But a big factor, man, is not trying to overfit the model. In fact, I will pick data points that have slightly less correlation to future production if I'm comparing them to two or three other things and I find something that's pretty close that I think really doesn't overlap with another data point another input that I have in the model.
I am going to tear up everything after this podcast. So appreciate that, Dwayne. Thank you. All the work
And
I
we
have
all
done
learn
over the last
together. I
couple
just
months. What?
from working on these things, man, and really studying them and getting deep into them.
Oh
But yeah,
man,
man,
oh
Brock
man, I
Bowers,
love it.
dude, back to him.
It's fun stuff. Yeah, yeah. Brock
Amazing.
Bowers and company, and his profile is obviously like ridiculous now, and and I do want to talk about the other tight ends here in a second. But like, if you're in a non-super flex dynasty rookie draft, no tight end premium, are you going Brock Bowers once the other three wide receivers are off the board? The first three wide receivers,
I think it's a decision point once you get to Odunze.
right? Right.
I'm gonna take Harrison and Neighbors above him, but once you get to Odunze, who also we'll talk about, I like, but I do think that Brock Bowers is a more special talent overall at his position. Now, I think you can make the argument that, well, wide receivers typically carry a higher ceiling, and I do agree with that. So, like, if you ran a simulation, 10,000 times, Odunze might win it. You know what I mean? But if you do hit on Bowers and he is like this generational prospect, and people get really burned by that because they're like, well, we thought Kyle Pitts was a generational He was, guys, and he still is.
He
I
still
still
is.
think Kyle Pitts is going to come through, but he might not ever live up to generational. It's a tough label to live up to, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that we should suddenly, because of that, just discount Brock Bowers. Like his
Right.
hit rate in the Fantasy Life supermodel, and this is just in the first 2 years, and you know how hard it is for tight ends to
Very.
produce in their first 2 years. Top 12 finishes, 100% of the players that have been in his tier
There you
have
go.
done it in their first 2 years. Now, it's a small tier because there's not many people as good as Brock Bowers, but top 9 finishes, 50%. So, and then if you look at him in the model without draft capital, 67% of those have gone on to have a top 12 finish in their first 2 years. So, I think there's also a little bit of a better floor for Bowers. I do think landing spot, obviously, is a factor because we've seen tight ends too many times. If you land on a team with another good tight end, it's very often a rotation in year one, even for good players like Bowers.
Now, moving to real football real quick. If you're the Jets at 10, right? Both Brock Bowers and Rome Odunze are on the board.
Bowers.
You going Bowers, huh? So see, my thing is this, right? Like, all right, I think if I had to pick a player who's going to have an instant impact, I think Rome Odunze, has a chance to make an instant impact just because of the fact that we've seen tight ends typically.
Well, I think that's up to the Jets, though, right? Bowers can have the
Yeah.
same impact. They just have to make up their mind. They're going to put him on the field no matter what. If you take Brock Bowers, that should be your mindset.
Right.
You need to
Yeah,
throw
no.
everything you know as a coach out the window about, well, I got to rotate this other guy. We just saw what Sam Laporta did.
Yeah.
And he landed in the perfect spot. I mean, we had
So are you
James
saying
Mitchell and Brock Wright, but
so
if
don't do what the Bills did with Dalton Kincaid, and don't do what Arthur Smith
Yeah.
did. Well, the first year with Kyle Pitts was just
he
fine.
did it his second
But,
year and third year too.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't do that. You invested in this player for a reason. Why? Because they can destroy linebackers and safeties. So just let them go do their job. Just let them go do their job. Defenses, believe me, are thanking you when you pull these guys off the field.
100%.
They are
100%.
thanking you. And I get it. Oh, well, I lose 15% in my run blocking. Who cares when you put the other dude out there? Like, the team knows you're about to run it.
That's
So, like, just keep Brock Bowers out there.
Now, when I look at the rest of this tight end class, I look at Jaheim Bell and his efficiency,
Yeah.
right? He just pops off the page. Third in this class in career yards per reception, first in career yards after the catch per reception, first in missed tackles forced per reception, second only behind Bowers in this class in yards per route run, doing it in the Power 5, relatively crowded offense. Like, is it crazy to like him more than Jatavian Sanders? I know that Sanders will likely get, the better draft capital, but like, is there some context that I might be missing here?
So with Jaheim Bell, like I like him. I think he's really good at the thing he does. What scares me really about him is, 33% of his targets came behind the line of scrimmage.
Right.
So that's a lot, man. And anytime you have a player that gets that propped up by basically scheming them touches, it's a little bit of a red flag if they don't also show an ability to win at the other areas of the field that we need them to. If they show they can do that as well, then it's okay. Then it's actually just a plus. Then you're like, holy crap. Like, because Brock Bowers was above the tight end average as well. So the average tight end gets let's see here, 11% of their targets come behind the line of scrimmage. Jaheim Bell was at 33%. Okay. Right. So he's good enough that they just want to get the ball in his hands. So that can still be a positive. But the where the red flag goes up for me is the best tight ends are really good in the intermediate area of the field. So that's 10 to 19 yards down the field. You need to be able to unlock that for your quarterback. You don't have to have it to be a good tight end, but to really like get to the next echelon, like a fantasy play, I think it is something that's necessary. And the average not even guys that were drafted, just the average college tight end, 24% of their targets come in that 10 to 19 range. When you look at Jaheim Bell, only 13%. Now, does that mean he can't do that? No, sometimes you just have a quarterback that maybe you're scared to death to throw to that area of the field. So you're like, well, Jaheim Bell's good. We don't have to turn the ball over. Let's just throw him a screen, So this can be tricky, but that's the red flag with Bell. It is the fact that so much, right, of his production came in that area of the field, and he leaned a little bit more heavily on it. And so the model, cares about that. And overall, that just shows up when you look at, Jaheim Bell's profile overall. I mean, he was a solid target earner, but at the same time, like we look at where he's expected to go in the draft, not great. He is a guy that if he suddenly got better draft capital would be good. Like his program quality index is 5%. So coming from a school not known for really putting out, good players, he could change that. Remember, these models are created to play probabilities. Well, how do you create probabilities? Well, it's based on here's the things that usually work the most. Someone's always going to break the mold. There's always going to be outliers to these things. So you got to remember that. And Jaheim Bell does offer the kind of profile where I could see that if he landed in the right spot. So my concern with him right now is maybe more of a narrow path to success. But if he landed with the right team, there's a chance he could do it. Like his speed score is pretty good. His career targeted quarterback rating at 117.1. Like it's not Brock Bowers at 141.9. But I mean, it's above Jatavian Sanders at 111. It's, a little below Theo Johnson. So I think there are things to like, about him. But he comes out in the 22nd percentile. And one note, when you guys look at the model percentiles, remember that because draft capital is worth so much up top, it's going to push a lot of guys down. So really, when you see a percentile score of like the 50th percentile, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because like if you look at all the prospects together, if you guys go count and you're like, oh, well, like I'm looking right now back to 2018. And if you look at the number of prospects that were just over the 50th percentile, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's great podcasting right there. Counting on the air. Only 12 guys are at the 50 percentile or higher. And the reason there's that big drop off from these guys in the 80th down to 50th is because draft capital matters so much, and it's now
even for tight ends,
being measured on a logarithmic scale.
So for tight ends too, I guess it goes back to your, what you said originally of what the resources that are put behind, what these tight ends who are being drafted day one, day two, right?
Okay. Yeah, narrow fit. But if Jaheim Bell landed in the right place, maybe he gets coaching that can develop him further. I think there are definitely like just when you watch Jaheim Bell, like for a guy his size, like, I'm not I watch all the players. I don't let film influence the way I grade these because I don't think I'm a film expert. Right. And I think that can get you into dangerous situations. So I try to really lean on the film gurus. Like Matt Waldman's one of my favorite because he's fully transparent about how he grades things, how he weights them. So like that clicks with me. But there are other good people. Like, for example, I tested Lance Zierlein's prospect grades on running backs back to 2016, 17. 0.59 correlation to future fantasy success. there are people in this industry that are grinding film that are really good at what they do that can add
Oh, yeah.
value. So I lean into them.
No, I like that a lot. And by the way, guys, make sure to go check out Dwayne's rookie supermodel articles at fantasylife.com. He talks about what goes into his model, like obviously all the stuff that he's talking about today, but he has that written form, how the incoming rookies stack up against that model based on the results. He has all his wide receivers and tight ends in tiers. And I'm pretty sure you have your running back supermodel coming out soon as well.
Yeah, it will come out on Monday. Again,
Perfect timing for this episode. This episode's coming out on Monday too, so
yeah,
perfect timing. I love it.
super excited about. So just I'll hit it real quick. We probably
Yeah,
have to do some rapid fire because I know you have a bunch of questions you want to get to, and I'm excited to
yeah.
hit them. But
Let's do it.
so the supermodel for running backs without draft capital, if you've ranked between the 80 without capital, I'm not even including a team's pick. If you rank between the 80th and 100th percentile, 100% of those players have gone on to become top 6 fantasy producers. There are only 3 of them, so it's a small sample. It's tough to score that high in the model, averaging 19.4 fantasy points per game. But let's say you go down to that between 60th and 80th percentile without draft capital. 88% of them go on to be a top 36 player, 75% top 24, 63% top 12, and 19% top 6. If you look at that against like just draft round alone, like those hit rates are actually better. So yeah, and that's where we want to get to. I'm not saying the model's perfect. I'm not saying that, it might change some in the future, like as new classes come in and, you add new data to your sample, like sometimes your correlations and things can go down, but obviously like I'll continue working on these things, trying to figure out if there's new things we can add, but I super excited. So yeah, I really want, folks, if you're listening to this, go check it out over at fantasylife.com.
What are the other factors outside of draft capital you account for most in your running back model?
So yeah, when you look at the running back model, the number 1 is draft capital. The number 2 factor in the model, 1 second, like I'm popping it open. The number 2 factor in the model right there with it is pedigree, like so where they come from, the school that they played for. And again, I'm also looking at it's not in the model yet, but I still look at all the different schools that recruited them, like and how good of a recruit they were.
Right.
But as far as in the model, it's the pedigree. And then you've got their production, which really comes to yards per team attempt. So we talked about RIPTA. Think of this as YIPTA, right? This is just yards per team attempt, period. So it's all your receiving yards and your rushing yards divided by all your team attempts. But you adjust it and you multiply receiving yards times 2, right? So it's called adjusted yards per team pass attempt. Because why? We know that yards are worth more at the NFL level on receptions because they at the NFL level for running back. Why? Because you're typically playing in a half PPR or a full PPR league, which adds points. And because we don't have target data super far back in the data, the easy way to cheat code that is say, fine, just give it, multiply by 2 for receiving yards. And then, so that's the main production metric. But from an efficiency standpoint, man, I have to give PFF a hat tip. Like if you're better than missed tackles force, yards after contact, explosive rush rate is PFF run grade. And then PFF receiving grade is stronger than yards per route run. So those things I put in a composite score together. And again, so kind of back to what we talked about with tight ends, where RIPTA is your team-based evaluation. Here's how the player performed in context of their team. Whenever you look at the PFF grades, that's really okay, great. But when they got their opportunity, how did they perform? And and when you really look at how PFF grades are created, I know a lot of people like kind of get weird about PFF grades, but it makes sense because if basically every move the player makes that adds value beyond, what they should have gotten on a play is how a PFF grade comes into existence. So it's taking into account into context so much more than missed tackles forced, because that could be against the light box where you had a perfectly blocked play. So a PFF run grade, if you've got a wide open lane and you get 20 yards, you get credit for it being a positive play. But that's different than, hey, there was a small crease you had to get through, then you had an evade a tackler immediately at the second level and outrun an angle of a safety to get that 20 yards. That play is worth more, and it should be. So finding a way that you have at scale can have data available to you that bakes that context in is huge. And the data tested out good. When I put those two things together into a composite score, it's one of the strongest data points in the model. So hat tip to PFF. And then finally,
I
I'm
kind
sorry,
of
go
I
ahead.
love that. No, I love that because you can use PFF grade, but then when you like you just did, you gave it the context that it's actually correlates better than yards after contact per attempt and missed
And
tackles
it's a way
forced
to
per attempt.
honestly account for all those things in one data point. Because the other
Yeah,
thing is
yeah,
sometimes you have guys that make a lot of missed tackles, but they don't ever go forward.
right.
Now, if it's because there's guys behind the line of scrimmage, like old Barry Sanders clips, there's 3 guys behind the line of scrimmage as soon as he gets the ball. Well,
Yeah.
okay, great. Then that's a plus. You avoided those things just to get a yard. That's going to show
Right,
up.
exactly. And 2
But
guys in this class, Trey Benson and Marshawn Lloyd, right?
oh yeah,
They if you notice, you watched them play, like, they did bounce a lot of runs to the outside when they might not have needed to, and they're near the top of this class in missed tackles forced per attempt.
exactly. And so if your missed tackles per attempt is actually adding value to the play, you get credit. If they're not, then it's just a missed tackle force, and you can still
Yeah.
read that data point. But yeah,
Mhm.
it's great context, to have, especially for the running backs, is what I noticed. So, super excited about that one. And the final one is Lance Zierlein's prospect grades from NFL.com because I tested those. I only gave it a small weight in the model. It actually tested stronger, but when I tested it against all my other variables with how balanced it is, I have a feeling that I don't know Lance's exact process, but it's a multivariable process that he's going through that honestly overlaps a lot with the things I'm already doing in the data. So I could have weighted it more and even made the model stronger, but in year one, I wanted to calibrate the model in a way that I feel like I'm not double counting a bunch of things. And I don't know for sure how all his stuff works, so I could be a little bit wrong on that. But just the way the data, the profile of his grades worked, I only gave it a 15% weight. But yeah,
Okay,
those are
okay.
those are the factors.
I got you. And when you look at raw production, like total raw production in college for these running backs, like you have your Ray Davises, your Blake Corums, but then you look at the efficiency, right? Yards after contact per attempt, missed tackles forced per attempt. Maybe that you can, throw in that, use the PFF grade as that composite score. Like, how do you look at those two things and say, like, all right, well, these running backs can produce. Almost any running back can produce when you give them a lot of volume, right? Like I tend to lean towards the guys who have better efficiency metrics who at least have a decent sample size. Similar things with receptions and receiving yards compared to like maybe yards per route run or
Yeah.
missed tackles forced per reception. How do those type of things factor into your model, and what do you think is the balance between those two?
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to the similar thing that we talked about earlier with RIPTA and career targeted quarterback rating, right? It's the same kind of thing here for running backs with these PFF grades. So you've got to have both in your model. And the reason why is because all programs are not created equal. Even though I'm going through other steps like program pedigree, think about it. Pedigree helps offset if you played with a bunch of other good teammates because you're getting a boost in the model from being from a really good school. So it helps players from Alabama, it helps players from LSU, it helps players from Ohio State. If you've had a lot of players come into the league, especially in the first round of the NFL draft, second, third round of the NFL draft, it's already helping offset the fact that you played with these other really good players. But you still want to be able to look at players that came from programs like that and see when they did have their opportunity, were they good? Right. And so this gives an opportunity for guys that, for whatever reason, never earned full-time roles, or maybe they had to fight through injuries that are clouding, some of the things we're looking at. It still gives them a chance to score well in the model. And when you think about it, what you just mentioned was perfect. Like the ultimate prospect is someone who came in, earned a lot of work early in their career, and they were efficient and they played on all the
Right.
downs. Like that's
Yeah,
Saquon
like
Barkley.
Jonathan Brooks. Jonathan Brooks, obviously, behind Bijan Robinson, right? Like he comes in and he's able
Yes.
to he's able to
Jonathan
do his
Brooks is a
thing.
great example,
Right.
because like what he did, with his opportunities once he got them really helped him in the model. And the fact that the pedigree is helping him because it's counting the fact that Bijan was a first round pick. Deonta Foreman's in there as a former. Now he didn't play with him, but Texas is still a good program, right? They've
Right.
put out some good running backs with not great ones, but you've got, Deonta Foreman going back. And then there's someone else I'm missing that, came out of Texas. Oh, Roshan Johnson, came out
Right.
with, Bijan. So that's helping him. But then also his ability to produce once he got that opportunity is really big. And that's where that PFF composite career score comes in. That's really putting rushing and receiving together.
Okay. Now, we're going to wrap up very shortly.
We can rapid fire, man. You just tell me.
I want to know if you had to take your pick at a potential day 3 running back from this year's class. This is obviously, relatively weaker running back class, I would say. But if you had to pick a potential day 3 running back from this year's class that can become a fantasy starter because he's that good, he's able to overcome the odds because of it, who would it be?
Yeah, so this is where, honestly, asking this question about the running backs is the best one, because like the pre-draft model without draft capital is really it's the strongest, right, against draft capital. It's outperforming it by the most versus the other things. So yeah, I'm just looking right now and I'm still writing these up today. Like I just got through putting all the data together, but I'm looking at like where some of these guys are projected, to go. And hang on one second. I actually just pulled together a new chart for this. Like when I saw I was like, I need to put this together, but it'll be good, like just to have in front of me, like whenever he asked me this question, and like a moron, I didn't already have it filtered. So yeah, when I look at this, so there's a few names here. One would be Jace McClellan out of Alabama. And why? Because he played with a lot of other really good running backs. Like he doesn't score great in the model, but when you look at the things he underscores on, what are they? Draft capital. He's a 0.03. That's a 3% draft capital index score. He might not even get drafted. His adjusted yards per team attempt is 37th percentile. But when you look at, his PFF composite score, it's 57th percentile. And then you look at his pedigree, it's in the 100th percentile because he comes out of Alabama. So that's a good example. That's mostly being driven off of pedigree, right? If you want to go down, a little bit further to some of these other guys that score well, that don't look as good, to your point, in the NFL's eyes, like Carson Steele is a name. Like he's not even expected to be drafted, but like he's young, program quality index is okay. And he's solid from an adjusted yards per team attempt. You don't hear anybody talk about this guy. And
not
then
at all.
61st,
he's not even in my draft kit, Dwain. Now
came out of
now
Ball State, and then he transferred to UCLA. Yeah, so he'll be in tier 3. And again, like guys, once I put this together, I just follow the model. Well, actually, he'll be lower than that when I release the model next week, because I'm releasing based on their expected draft capital. But the way I answer this question you're giving me was, I just sort on the pre-draft capital model and compare it to guys that don't have good draft capital, and then that gives me the list of the guys like that I think have a chance to outperform their draft capital.
I love it.
So
is there a wide receiver in this class who you think is being overlooked in this draft process?
I think people have warmed up early on. It was Ladd McConkey, because people just thought he was like this underneath slot player. And I know that Xavier Worthy is being talked about as a late first rounder, early second rounder, but I still think that like I get the traits thing with Adonai Mitchell, but it's Adonai Mitchell has a major bust risk to him. Like, I mean, his profile is bad from a production standpoint. It's okay from an efficiency standpoint, but it's not great. And he's just never been able to be consistent. Whereas Xavier Worthy, man, exploded as a freshman, wasn't as good as in a sophomore, junior years, but still comparative, like at least speaking at his age, at those ages, he was still good. And man, what's the thing you hear most people worry? Like, well, I don't know if he can beat press coverage. Well, it's really hard to have a 32% targets per route run against man coverage without being able to beat press in some way, shape, or form. Now, the other thing is, like, if you land with a smart coach, like Xavier Worthy should be on the move. You should be stacking him. You should be getting him clean releases. So landing spot could be a bit of a factor for him, but so far, like his ability against press coverage hasn't, been terrible. Like, I mean, I'm not saying that it's perfect, but when you win that much against man coverage, you're going to be fine. So, and then if you're just looking like for pure sleeper, and again, you guys can go check these out, like over on the site, you can sort them all for yourself. But like looking at, one sec, who's the other one? Jermaine Burton is the one. Now he's got some off the field stuff that obviously, he hit a woman after a Tennessee game. There are major red flags with this man's, character. I'm not here to be the judge and the jury on it, but I'm calling it out. So I don't know where he'll go in the draft. But again, we're talking about an Alabama player, played with a lot of other good players. So that impacts like his ability from a career, adjusted from a career RIPTA standpoint. But once you do the other factors that I'm doing, which is adjusting for his teammates, adjusting for all the other factors, it comes out in a more solid, it's not elite, but it's still good. But again, you look at him when he was targeted, a 115.8 career targeted quarterback rating. That's good. That's above Adonai Mitchell, right? That's in a good range. So this is a guy that, played in a crowded program. He was a highly thought of recruit, and he comes with some efficiency stuff that I like. When he was given his opportunities, he played really, really well.
Yeah, and one thing, with Xavier Worthy, you mentioned like the outs earlier, right? Like I read this off of what you wrote in your article about it, saying that, he did produce underneath and he also produced down the field, right? And the fact that he
Yes.
has that in his profile is a major
Yep.
advantage, to when you're kind of prospecting from him, opposed to Jalen. I think Burton could be in a situation where a lot of his stuff was down the field and big plays, and he doesn't have much after the catch ability. Is there as many outs? And that's one of the reasons why Worthy is going to be taken, probably near the end of the first round, right?
And with Burton,
Yeah.
he is one that's interesting. Like if you read what the film grinders are looking at with him, many of them do believe that he has more to his game, and that's the role he was asked to play. And it kind of goes back to what you and I talked about before. Sometimes that's the case, sometimes it's not. The model doesn't know for sure, so it's counting that against him right now.
Exactly.
But there's always outliers to this. So I always try to acknowledge those things when I'm writing. If I see like a dissenting view from the model, from the people like that are experts at watching the film, like I try to note it, and that is a note around Jermaine Burton.
And that's the story around AD Mitchell too, man, because it's like polar opposites. Production profile versus film is like opposites. You know what I mean? So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, where he ends up. It's always great talking
AD Mitchell
to Dwain.
just feels like he should be like a third round pick.
No, you're good.
Second round, fine.
Oh,
you want to
man.
go all
Dwain.
in on traits. I just,
Dwain's
man, first round pick feels like I'm not an NFL team, right? And obviously they've got people running all sorts of numbers on this stuff, but it could end up being wrong. But man, like my closest comps in the model were Marquez Valdez-Scantling and Miles Boykin. So, we've seen this profile before.
Oh, man.
Really athletic, flashes,
Right.
but ultimately could never put it together. Again, like I'm only working off data back to 2018 because I need average depth of target and things to do the kind of work I do. So
right.
Like, it's not a huge sample size. There are going to be more outliers that hit as we go. And there will probably be some in the future that will be his profile. Hey, never did really anything, but had the traits and he ended up being a hit.
And then if he ends up hitting, everyone's going to point to him as being the guy who's going to be the model for every other wide receiver.
That's the problem. You don't want to calibrate your model in the future to the outliers. You just can't.
Exactly.
You want to study them and understand them and see if there is an angle in the data that you can figure out that makes sense to the broader scope of your model. But as soon as you start, saying, oh, well, because AD Mitchell did it, the next guy can do it, like you really get in trouble.
Yeah, man. All right. Well, you're always dropping gems, man. A lot of nuggets. I learned a lot. I'm gonna have to listen to this again myself, because I was trying to pay attention to you and not write notes at the same time. So I'm gonna be listening to this again and reworking my entire draft kit. Thanks a lot, Dwain. Really appreciate that. You just added way more work to my plate. The rookie supermodels, great resource for all of us during draft period, man. Dwain, thank you so much for joining. And we'll talk soon.
All right, man. Hey, I appreciate you having me on, and never doubt your work. You already do great work. So I do the same thing to myself. I will find something new as I'm working and be like, well, crap, now I've got to rewrite these other three parts of these other three players I've already written up. So I feel you.
Yeah, man. All right. Take it easy, man. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.